So I wanted to begin with an interesting story. So I was telling my parents I was going to give this presentation, and they assumed that it was for like work. And so I mentioned the topic, and the question was, what is the use of the topic? And that was a very curious question. So when we think of use, we usually think of value. Something is useful, and so something is valuable. It's useful for something. So, if I was eating something, it would be useful to make me not hungry. And somehow the value of this thing that is useful seems to depend on that which it is used for. But if you go down this chain of what you're valuing, the question becomes, what is intrinsically valuable? And how does one lead their life based on this intrinsic value? So here, what we have is that we see that everything is grounded on value, and it drives motivations, actions, dreams, hopes, etc. Now, even among the transcendentals, if you look at truth, you see something as true because you see it as valuable. Similarly, that you seek the good and you see it as valuable. Here, I want to distinguish good and value. Good is something that is in the object itself, and then value, there's a relation between the object and you as a subject. So what does this mean? How do we know what is intrinsically valuable? And value seems self-evident. When we think something is intrinsically valuable, we think it is self-evident for us. So for example, if it was happiness, or if it was something else priceless, in some sense, if it was intrinsically valuable, there's a certain self-evidentness to that value. And this is the same kind of self-evidentness that you experience when you see something beautiful, a kind of sense in which it just presents itself as valuable. So we will explain more of this. And it seems we cannot reason to what is intrinsically valuable discursively. It seems that that is what you start off with, like your axioms, so to speak. And if it is your axioms and not something you reason to, then how does one begin with the right axioms to begin? Now, this brings us to the question of what in fact is knowing. In order to know what is intrinsically valuable, one needs to know what is knowing here. And there is two kinds of knowing. There is knowing intellectus, and there's ratio. Intellectus is a simple, total, immediate grasp of an object, and ratio is kind of a deliberative, discursive, non-immediate grasp of the object. Now, what does this mean? So I'll start off with an example. So if you have kind of a plant, and you're examining a plant, intellectus is the total apprehension of the plant as a whole, and it is immediate. It is similar to kind of a sense perception. It is immediate, it is total, and it's simple. Ratio is kind of what you have for your premise conclusion. You deliberate through careful attention and focus on the different aspects of the argument. And so you're proceeding slowly, and it tends to be very complex as well. Now, there is an interesting quote from Leisure as the Basis of Culture by Pieper, where he speaks that the highest knowledge is effortless. And it's a very curious thing to say, because here, intellectus, there's a kind of effortlessness in the use of intellectus, in the use of something that's simple, total, immediate. And yet, it's a kind of insight that perhaps ratio itself may not be able to attain to, or if it did, it would be really slowly. But in the case of value, since it is self-evident and slow, and since it's self-evident and immediate, what we look at for the process of knowing what is valuable is through intellectus. So a lot of first philosophy in history, epistemology in history, etc., has been based on axioms or grounded philosophy, or proceeding from first principles and then reasoning from your first principles to building a kind of a foundation of knowledge, a set of statements that you call true, for example. Now, the problem with this is, again, how do you know which axioms to start off with? And the next is, they seem to be quite prone to error in the way one proceeds from axioms to the statements afterwards. So here we have another process, the process of intellectus. And here the goal isn't certainty, so to speak, it is clarity. Now, what in fact is clarity is where intellectus comes in, because in intellectus, the process of intellectus allows one to see something immediately, and it is there is a degree of clarity to which one sees something. The question isn't so much of is whether that thing that I see exists, but rather how clearly is it that I see what I see. The self-evidentness of the axioms mean that you're not so much going for what is certain, because they are self-evident and they already have an interior criterion of verification to the self-evidentness of these axioms, but rather it's more the clarity to which one sees what is one valuable and how it drives one's sight. Now, the process of intellectus is also not so verbal as the ratio, and I will explain more of this later on. And so, which means that when I mean by clarity, it's also not just clarity of language or clarity of expression or statements, but clarity of sight. So intellectus is how beauty operates, which is simple, total, immediate, and pre-verbal. And this will be something we'll talk about as well, that it precedes any kind of interior or exterior discussion or expression of what one has seen. Now, the next question is, how can we have intellectus as a new kind of epistemology in proceeding with axioms rather than the use of reason, ratio? Ratio is still integral in supplementing it, but you still need a kind of sight to see values, for example. Now, first question is, when we see something as valuable, it seems we can be easily mistaken. So maybe I had seen something as valuable, a few days ago, or a year or 2 years ago, and now I no longer see it as valuable. And there is a way in which, how do I know that what I see right now, what is valuable, is in fact valuable, right? There still seem to be a lack of clarity here. And so how do I, in fact, trust this kind of methodology? So this is one question in the back of your head, and that we will go through as we go through the slides. And the second is, what is the methodology of this? So ratio reason seems pretty straightforward in the kind of methodology that we're using. But what exactly is the methodology for an aesthetic experience or intellectus? And how do we cultivate this? So before we go into kind of exploring this further, we'll go a bit into the historical context of this. So broadly, there are two camps in the philosophy of beauty, and one is kind of the camp with Plato, and the other is kind of the camp with Kant. And this is just like a broad characterization. So for Plato, the first thing is that desire precedes judgment. And what I mean by here is Plato operates by kind of a certain statement he says in the Symposium, and this is the main kind of place by which you can elucidate the philosophy of beauty that kind of proceeds from there, from Plato to kind of Augustine or Nehemiah, etc. and so on. Is one loves what is beautiful, and then one desires something that one is in want of. And to love a thing is to desire its possession. And there are three interesting concepts that when we explore Plato that we have to pay attention to. And one is, besides, we have the beautiful object, and we have love, and he characterizes it as a kind of desire. And then third, we have a kind of possession. And he ties all of these three together very intimately in what love is and what possession is, and in accordance to what relating to something that's beautiful. Now, here for Kant, judgment precedes desire. So for Kant, it is an aesthetic judgment that occurs, and one would have the appropriate pleasures that arise out of it if one had the right judgment of what is beautiful. So for Kant, the aesthetic judgment is quite primarily cognitive. And the other features of his aesthetic judgments are, first, that it's universal. So here, Kant argues this because he says, even though one may like to say that one's judgment of taste is subjective, he still goes on to say how one could still debate with someone else or argue with someone else about an aesthetic judgment. So there's still some kind of debate between different people's aesthetic judgment and some kind of base which people base their debates on. And Kant uses this to describe what are the universal criterions behind how judgments of taste occur and the criterions for that, or cultivation of that judgment as well. And he ties this actually not towards the object itself, but rather certain invariant structures of the faculties of a person. And so since these invariant structures are present in each individual, it is universal to that extent. So he's at once universal, but not objective in that sense. So the first thing that we want to analyze, so for the interest of both of the scope of this presentation, etc., we are not going to focus on Kant as much. First, we're going to focus on the Socratic argument that we see in Symposium. And there is a very curious argument that you have that where the conclusion is very non-intuitive and one would naturally disagree with. And I think it's very interesting. So like when we read this, which premise seems off? Let's go through this. So Socrates says, love is always love of something. So love always desires that which it loves. One who desires is always in present need of what they desire. What one is in present need of can only be something one does not yet possess. Love is always of beauty or the beautiful. So love desires beauty or the beautiful. So love is in present need of beauty or the beautiful. So love does not yet possess beauty or the beautiful. What does not yet possess beauty isn't beautiful. So love isn't beautiful. Good things are always beautiful. So love isn't good. So how would one counter this argument? It'd be a very interesting thing to see. And I think one of the few interesting things to take note of here is, I think one who desires is always in present need of what they desire. That's, I think, something that we will look at as we go on. The next one would be revelation. What does it mean to say a revelation of value? Here, we are not looking at beauty just as a property of an object, but rather a beauty as a particular kind of relation between the subject and the object that allows the subject to experience the object as beautiful. And this relation is what allows the revelation of value, rather than the beautiful as a property residing within the object itself. Now, in order to elucidate what exactly this relation is, I'm going to give like a quick summary of relevant concepts in phenomenology. So the first thing to note here for phenomenology is phenomenology is based on intentionality. Now, what is intentionality? So intentionality doesn't mean like one intends to do something, etc., and so on. It is basically there is a kind of intending and there's an object intended. And so for example, let's say you're looking forward to a game, a soccer game that you're going to watch. Then there is a certain sense in which you're anticipating the game that's happening. And this anticipating is the kind of intending that's directed towards the game in the future. And then when you're actually watching the game, then there is a kind of intending which is happening, which is the watching, and the object intended is the game that you see, for example. And similarly, when you finish the game, there is you recalling the game, and then recalling itself or remembering is a kind of intending directed towards the object intended, which is the game here too. Now, so everything has this act-object duality essentially, where there is an intending and there is an object intended. So what Husserl uses as his terminology is the noesis and the noema, which is the intending, the noesis, and noema, which is the object intended. Now, one thing to note here is the object that is intended doesn't necessarily have to have any kind of existence or property. So for example, if you are you could be dreaming unicorn. And so dreaming is a kind of intending, and the unicorn is the object intended from the dreaming. Now, the main thing in phenomenology is the phenological reduction, and this is the crucial part. Before we understand what this is, we need to distinguish between two kinds of attitudes. There is a natural attitude, and there is a phenomenological attitude. Now, the natural attitude is the one in which what I mentioned, there is a kind of intending and there's object intended. So what you do when you're going around in your daily life. So, when you're looking at something, you're looking at a tree, you're looking is the intending, and the tree is the object intended. Now, the phenomenological attitude is what happens when you bracket this whole phenomena as it is in your natural attitude, and then you adopt a particular attitude towards it in order to analyze it. Now, there are two steps in the phenological reduction. The first is called epoche, which is bracketing. Now, what bracketing is essentially a suspension of belief into the existence of any of the objects in the natural attitude. Now, this does not mean that you are questioning the existence, etc., but rather you are kind of distancing yourself away from them so that you can return to them with greater clarity. And this kind of bracketing allows you to stay true to the phenomena as it is and analyze it for its invariant features. And so in the second step, which is a reduction, is where you are trying to draw out what are the invariant features of the noetic act. And from here, try to give a description of the object as it is. And this is what when Husserl goes on to explain how he also gives a characterization of being, etc., and so on. And since it's invariant, there is intersubjective agreement. This is distinguished from Kant, because Kant, there is kind of a distinction between things in your head and things that are out there, and then one may or may not be able to know what are the things out there. And so he makes a distinction between the appearances and the objects of cognition and the things in themselves. Now, Husserl does not say things in themselves. He doesn't say that they're objects inaccessible to us. What he's looking at is the phenomena as it is, and using that to fully elucidate what is there. Now, the two kind of essential features of any kind of experiencing is intuition and passive synthesis. Now, intuition is basically the immediate cognitive relationship that you have to objects of knowledge. And what does this mean? It means there's a sense in which when one senses an object, for example, there is an immediate givenness of the object in one's consciousness. And this givenness of the object presenting itself is intuition. Next is the passive synthesis. Now, passive synthesis is the attitude in the natural attitude where in the phenomena, what happens is the ego does not participate in the givenness of this object. It is not you as an active person, like in Kant, kind of making the object as a whole in your consciousness. It is rather the object is given to you as a whole already, and that is what you experience in the phenomena. So yes, it is a givenness of unity in our consciousness or our natural attitude. So the next thing is, let's look at these stars. And what we want to do is kind of actually go into an example of what we're actually doing, like phenomenological reduction. And we want to go back to experiences themselves. And so it's a common experience everyone has, is just looking at stars and just being awed by how beautiful it is. Now, what were features of this experience? So there are two things that one has when one sees the stars primarily, and that is stillness and wonder. Now, what exactly is the stillness I'm talking about? There is a certain kind of interior stillness that is pre-verbal and immediate, and it proceeds from a kind of silence or interior kind of silence of contemplation, which allows one to first recognize what is good and then appreciate what is good. And both of this recognition and appreciation is also initially pre-verbal. Now, afterwards, verbally, one can praise it if one is so affected. And so praise can be expressed in two kinds of ways. One is congratulations, which is the affirmation of the greatness of the object that is experienced, or thanks, which is to talk about its benefits to oneself and others. Now, another thing that we note when we look here is that there's a certain sense in which when we look at the object, there's a way in which the object brings us out of ourselves. And it seems that the object is leading and we are following. And there's a sense in which there's a certain kind of receptivity in the beholder, in the subject, that allows one to be led by the object that one is experiencing. Now, if we were to go back to an experience of the stars, we see that our attention is kind of captured or captivated by the object that we are beholding. And there is a direction of our attention towards it. Now, curiously, this also has a very interesting tie-in with Simone Weil talks earlier of how attention is itself, simple attention itself is a kind of prayer almost of fear or of a kind of loving gaze as well. Now, the other thing that we note here is the stillness is also a kind of position of rest. Now, the position of rest, the state of rest, is where one is open to the invitationality of the object, which is at once gentle. It doesn't coerce you into following the lead of the object, so to speak. Yeah, so we can see that this is common to objects that are beautiful that we experience, and according to the degree of the good that we recognize and appreciation of the good that we recognize, there are different kinds of reactions towards it as well. So the next is, there's essentially kind of a broad 3 stages in this experience of beauty. One is kind of a receptivity. So there's an openness to the object's invitation. And the second is there's a kind of attention towards the object that the object kind of captures as a result of this receptivity that you have. And this leads to a kind of attentive gaze that you have from the object. The third is leading to a kind of savoring or recognition of the object's goodness, where here is where you have an experience of beauty that is immediate and simple and is initiated by the object. So the next thing to look at is wonder. what exactly is wonder? What is this experience of wonder that I have? What exactly is awe? So wonder is amazement, and it's also a kind of experience that one has that is pre-verbal and immediate. And it's a kind of state that one enters into with the kind of attention that I spoke of earlier. And it also leads one to sustain the kind of attention that one had. So it's kind of cyclic when one is in a state of wonder. Now, wonder also has a sense in which it tries to express more than what is there. And there's a way in which a lot is compressed into a small space. Now, I'll clarify what I mean here. There is a kind of initiation into a mystery here. And when looking at something that's beautiful or contemplating something that's beautiful, there is a sense in which one has a lot of rich discursive insights that one gets afterwards when one is reflecting or analyzing the experience that one has. And there's a kind of generosity of the object that one has that's infinite. Now, this infiniteness isn't there when one uses a process of ratio. Like you see, that's very deliberative and step by step. But in the kind of use of intellectus, there's a way in which it tries to capture everything that there is into such a small space. And here, there's a way in which the object, the beautiful object, points to something beyond itself. And here's where the kind of mystery arises, where the object itself arises as some kind of symbol or metaphor in the way that it points to something beyond itself. And it is this kind of symbolic nature of the object as a symbol or metaphor, that leads to kind of the richness of expression of the object in leading you to rich discursive insights after in the meditation following the contemplation, for example. And so what happens here then is a reorientation of one's sight that comes from an affirmation of value that one has when looking at objects. Now, there's still kind of two things that we have to address. One is what still is the criterion of verification that we talked about earlier. And second is, how do we enter into this state of rest from which there is a kind of receptivity to the object? So the second thing also is how do we address the worries that we had with contemplator? So one thing to note about contemplator is that Plato's form of desire seems almost selfish, because one desires what one is in lack of, and it seems this kind of desire is purely there because one lacks something. And it also seems to be fickle, because when the desires change, it seems the kind of judgment of something as beautiful also changes. For Kant, there is also a way in which it seems overcognitive, because that does not seem intuitively to be how we experience things as well. Now, here, using the phenological reduction and like analyzing it, I think it's possible to have a proper synthesis for both of these camps, essentially. And here is where we distinguish between kind of Plato's conception of desire and possession to modify it, and perhaps also address the argument that we saw earlier. For Plato, it is the desire to have the object. But for us, it's not the desire to possess the object, but rather the possession of the sight of the object, the sight of the beautiful. And is also the desire to see the beautiful. Now, what do I mean here? So one thing to note is that this desire that comes is a kind of desire that's awakened from the experience of beauty, from the affirmation of value or goodness of a beautiful object. And the desire doesn't proceed so much so as from a lack of something you have, but rather it is kind of a superabundance of something. And so one desires as if they were empty, but yet there is a certain desiring that happens from the superabundance of the object that is desired, so to speak. So the first thing to look at is possession isn't necessarily negative, right? When we say my father, my brother, my sister, etc., there's a kind of possession of love. And here, possession is a kind of relation. It is a possession of relation versus a possession of object that Plato seems to focus on. And so this possession of relation is the same kind of relation that sight has, where sight is a relation between subject and object. So there are two kinds of desires that we have here. The desire relating to the relation between the subject and the object, and the desire relating to the possession of the object. Now, the second kind of desire is a kind of selfish attachment, so to speak. It's not for the object's sake so much so as for kind of for your own sake, so to speak. what happens here is that there's a kind of corruption of that desire of the relation between the subject and object. Now, of course, one may ask, what does this mean in terms of virtues? Don't you desire to possess virtues? And virtues are something good naturally. So we'll go to this later. And another thing to note too is the curious thing that even in the kind of the creation story is God saw that it was good. And the seeing that it was good is a kind of affirmation that something is good. And this affirmation comes also through the creative process, the creation. How is this different from the first kind of desire, which is the relation between the subject and the object? Now, this first kind of desire, I think, is what ties to love, where it's a kind of desire that arises from the willing of the good of another. I wouldn't identify the desire itself as love, but something that arises from the willing. It means that there's a proper relation or sight between the subject and object that allows for reaffirmation of good in the object that is already there, to will the reaffirmation. So which means that there's already a kind of reorientation of sight in affirming a beautiful object's value. Now, the curious thing here is when we look at an object and we see that it's beautiful, there is a sense in which we see ourselves in the eyes of the other. And here the object could be a person too. And so there's a way in which in the affirmation of value of an object, due to the reorientation of our sight, we are also able to affirm our own value as well. So next is love begets creation. Now, what exactly does this mean? Now, there's a desire to remain in sight of the object. You want to keep the object that's beautiful in your sight. And so once that experience is over, the natural impulse that you'd experience is to now imitate the object and create something like that object. And so you want to make copies of it. Maybe you talk about it, you sing about it, or you paint it, etc. And there are different ways in which you try to imitate the object that you see. And in the different ways in which this imitation can occur, it cannot be in kind of a physical manifestation of how you create something, an artistic creation, and it can also be in a manifestation in your actions. Your actions itself is a kind of creation that proceeds from the kind of desire that one has when one is beholding a beautiful object. The next is what exactly we are creating here is the desire to reproduce the kinds of goodness that is seen in the object. And the curious thing is, as we create, we can see more clearly, and the kind of creative process itself is also at once a way in which one sees clearer and clearer and allows one to create and recreate. And there is a kind of generosity here as well. There's a no end to clarity to how clear one can see something. And so there's the same mystery of the object, the beautiful object, leads to a kind of the mystery of this desire between the relation between the subject and object, the mystery of love. The next thing is there's a kind of labor that also proceeds from this kind of creation. There's a labor of love that is very intimately tied with the labor that leads towards creation. And this is a kind of labor that is a kind of a pain of detachment of the self that proceeds from desiring the relation between the subject and object rather than just the possession of the object itself. And the criterion of verification here is there's the self-evidentness of the sight that one has when one is seeing something. And it becomes clearer as one engages in this process of seeing. Now, you may ask, isn't it possible to see wrongly, so to speak? Here, what happens is one can be mistaken, but when one realizes one is mistaken, one does so because of a unique phenological quality in the kinds of experience that one has when like seeing something more clearly. And seeing something more clearly means that there's a recognition that what one saw less clearly or was not as accurate, for example. And the methodology, the state of rest itself is a kind of state that one enters into with a kind of proper attitude that one has towards the object, which is a kind of attitude of receptivity that comes from a kind of attention towards the object that's presented, a kind of gaze that's oriented outside of itself.